So I want to thank the List Center, Paul and Henrietta and others here for having me here. And also thanks to the Max Wasserman Forum. It's a real pleasure to be able to be here to discuss these issues. So thank you to Jackson and Lenny. My name is Kian Goh. I'm Assistant Professor of Urban Planning at UCLA. And I study broadly urban design, politics, and environment. So currently, my research focuses on the politics around urban climate change adaptation, queer space in cities, and I'm as well increasingly interested about the role of art in and of cities. So we're in a particular historical moment of intersecting and compounding crisis. So notwithstanding some welcome news earlier this week in the election, we have on one level increasing social disparities and continued assaults on our social fabric, with recently in the US, threats made against the legitimacy and belonging of immigrants and gender nonconforming folks and trans folks. On another level, we face the existential crisis of climate change and the inadequacy of our most dominant political economic systems to produce justly and sustainably. And we confront the crisis of meaning when the facts are under siege, twisted, and distorted. And in this context, with challenges to the local and the immediate, to the long range and global, and the way we know things, art practices have the possibility to do two things: to make meaning for the present and to imagine alternative futures. This is a possibility that this panel, I think, presents, to think about such work from within our disciplines and our institutions, looking out at broader notions of being and belonging in various spaces. How do we do this work? So before I decided to focus more on urban research, I worked as an architect in New York City, and there I got to meet and collaborate with folks from the Audre Lorde Project and FIERCE, two organizations fighting for social and economic justice for queer people of color. So I became an architect who received political training by radical queer organizers. And these organizers showed me how political change should be thought about by focusing on organizing with and for the most oppressed and marginalized among us: trans and gender nonconforming folks, the young and the old, and those necessarily implicated in institutional systems, such as Black and brown folks confronting unjust policing and welfare recipients. Transformative change from the bottom up. And I think we'll hear a lot about this from the panelists today. For those of us who have lived this life, we know intimately that gender and space are interconnected. The ways we exist, move through, and present in the world actively produce the space we experience. But I think that what seems particularly interesting and relevant right now is to think about the ways in which those most marginalized by our institutions, including queer, trans, and those challenging the gender binary, have asserted claims on space. And to consider how those kinds of claims might tell us about envisioning different, more liberatory futures. So while queer and trans folks have garnered some incipient and provisional victories, including visibility, acceptance, and inclusion, could we now consider our role to invoke maybe appropriately a more a military term, a vanguard position towards more transformative structural change? And I think we see this interest in thinking about radical gender, thinking about and through a radical gender and space lens in the work of queer and gender theorists, certainly. And we also see this among artists, architects, and designers. Further, these activists and artists and scholars who are probing gender and space are paying much more attention to the making of physical space, the concrete environments in which we inhabit. So there are three things I'd like to highlight for this session, and then I'll introduce the panel. First, on one term in the title of the panel, publics, and what is at stake? What is public anyway? And to put it slightly differently, how do we find the common or to find commons between us? I was involved in a discussion about publics and commons recently, and I was kind of astonished about the range with which ideas about them are understood. So anywhere from state-designated public space, such as parks and streets, which we know are not really free for many queer and trans folks, to a kind of social constructed commons, physical or sometimes simply social spaces in which individuals and groups exercise a range of belonging. When we know then that the public we mean, the public we want, it's not the state-sanctioned public, then how do we think about the ways in which new spaces of belonging can be created collectively? And I think this is rather different from the necessary individual fights for self-identification and agency, for instance, for pronoun use. Second, on space and physicality, as space and constructed environments, whether built or natural, become more part of the ways in which we think about gender in publics, how do those in allied fields, such as queer theory, gender studies, science and technology studies, anthropology and sociology, look at space and the making of space? For architects and designers, the making of space is as much. Sometimes Siri just wants to listen to me, even though I'm not calling for it. Siri. So, for architects and designers, the making of space is as much about process and organization as physical object. This is integral to design practice. How might we consider then ideas of space and physicality across different ways of knowing and explaining the world? And then third, on the relationship between the two other terms in the title, pedagogies and policies. Pedagogies and policies are two terms that do not necessarily make sense together. One, pedagogies is about teaching, knowing, learning, and the other, policies, about implementing, defining, and to much extent, controlling. And perhaps, for me, the idea of publics does cut across these two terms, and that maybe a more concerted inquiry from a gender perspective into the multiple makings and belongings in publics can help us negotiate between these two other terms. One much more reflexive, and the other much more about creating certain action. So our three speakers today come from across visual and spatial fields, academic scholarship and arts practice, and across physical and political geographies. Lucas Crawford is Associate Professor of English at the University of New Brunswick. He studies transgender and fatness from a humanities perspective. He has published 2 poetry collections, Sideshow Concessions, and the Highline Scavenger Hunt, and a research monograph entitled Transgender Architectonics, The Shape of Change in Modernist Space. Zethu Matebeni is the African Humanities Program Fellow and Senior Researcher at the University of Cape Town. Her intellectual contribution primarily focuses on the development of African queer theory in South Africa. Zethu has published numerous books and journal articles, including Queer in Africa, LGBTQI Identities, Citizenship and Activism, and Reclaiming African, Queer Perspectives on Sexual and Gender Identities, focusing on art activism and queer theory making. Carlos Motta is an artist. He creates work engaging with histories of queer culture to insist that the politics of sex and gender represent an opportunity to articulate definite positions against social and political injustice. His recent exhibitions include a career survey at Museo de Arte Moderno de Medellín and solo exhibitions at the Stedelijk Art Museum in Amsterdam and at the Museo de Arte de la Universidad Nacional in Bogotá. And he has been named a Guggenheim Foundation Fellow and has received grants from Art Matters, the New York State Council on the Arts, and the Creative Capital Foundation. So what we'll do, thank you for your time, by the way. What we'll do is to go in that order. Each of the speakers will present. We'll have a short question and answer session among us and then open to questions and answers from the public. Thank you.
Thank you to everyone who had a role in having me be here today. Jackson, wherever you are, you're a star. Give that guy a PhD, get him out of here. He's awesome. And thank you all for being here. And thank you, Kian, for that lovely framing and introduction. Let me open with what hopefully sounds like a somewhat simple basic premise. People who defy, oh, that's my name. People who defy gender norms have been defined as a public health problem for others. And visual art has assisted in this definition. Oh, and there's my name again. And here's my actual first slide. We know that Buffalo Bill in The Silence of the Lambs sews a suit of women's skin after being denied sex reassignment surgery. We know that the protagonist of Dressed to Kill is a male psychiatrist who's also his own troubled patient, the murderous woman, Bobby. We know Norman Bates' homicidal nature in Psycho manifests precisely as cross-dressing, and now that Hollywood has heard of trans men, we have characters like CSI's Paul Millender, a trans serial killer set on becoming/fucking his own late father. Given the frequency with which we see the equation of crazy because trans because crazy, it's unsurprising that psychologists have nothing short of a trans fetish. And it's okay if you don't know these texts, but hello, Hirschfeld, Ellis, Benjamin, Money, and my Canadian content for the day is Zucker. Am I one behind? No, I'm good. Zucker, who championed conversion therapy for trans kids at Canada's largest mental health hospital until 2015. As such, we pop into the DSM, kind of the holy Bible of mental illnesses, with the third edition in 1980 and remain in the current 2013 edition. This is all to say, as an opening premise, that transgender and mental illness exist as categories and realities in tension. So it's by refusing to be stigmatized as crazy that trans people may obtain some dignity, underline may, but it's by proving that we have a legitimate mental condition, that we are in fact mentally ill, that trans people are sometimes able to access resources, underline sometimes. The way I see it, we could idle in this impasse of are we or aren't we crazy? Or we could ask, turning to the themes of the panel, has mental illness always been about public gender nonconformity? Consider Greek myth. The daughters of Proteus famously refused to worship Dionysus, god of wine and boners, which is to say, it didn't say boners in the script, but it came out. Which is to say they decline his drunk orgies. So he turns them mad, and they wander the countryside and allow their clothes to fall into disrepair, gasp. Until other women followed suit, and basically their dad, Proteus, gets Melampus to drug them with hellebore to cure them, to bring them back into line. Consider etymology. The word hysteria, as many have noted, comes from the Greek word hystera, that is uterus. Plato attributes hysteria to a wandering womb, a woman's crazy behavior caused by literally unhinged organs. Elsewhere in ancient Greece, physicians believed that women produced female semen. They were like so close, but so far. Produced female semen, which, if not ejected regularly via sex with her husband, would, quote, send up filthy vapors to the brain that cause madness. In all of those stories, please hear one enduring message: you're crazy if you don't want to fuck me. Only my dick will restore you to sanity, which is very convenient. You'll be fit for the public when you've met my private needs. So, second opening premise for me is mental illness isn't a label applied to gender or to trans folks. Rather, normative gender is built right into Western concepts of sanity. Let me continue then by not rejecting the stereotype that trans people are crazy, as many organizations are currently doing. Let me speak instead of 4 gender nonconforming people who were removed from the public as public health concerns. First, 1879, Australia, Edward de Lacy Evans was arrested, committed to Bendigo Hospital, eventually transferred to Kew Asylum. For over 6 weeks, Evans refused to bathe, I hear that, until the staff stripped him by force, at which point they found what they would understand as a female body. The media went wild for this. A photographer even snuck in and took this photo of Evans in a straitjacket, which I think is so difficult to look at. Discharged 3 months later, cured by virtue of his donning of dresses, he began a short and unsuccessful career in freak shows, and 1 year later moved into a benevolent asylum, an asylum for the poor, and died there 20 years later. All to say, the gendering practices of the asylum caused a social and financial break from which this person did not ever recover. Second, Joseph Lobdell, New York State, arrested in 1859 for impersonating a man, which led to a 21-year stay in an institution for the poor. In 1879, the New York Times reported his death, but spookily, he was alive. His brother had him committed to an insane asylum in 1880, where he remained, everyone believing he was dead, or as good as dead, until he died 32 years later. It's a long time. One of Lobdell's doctors suggested the following, quote, "It would be charitable and just if society would protect them, in asylums, from the ridicule and aspersion they must always suffer in public." Thanks. Similarly, in 2016, young trans writer Jaden Prondo writes of being housed in isolation in a women's wing of a psych ward in Torrance, California, despite all of his IDs reading male per his identity. A nurse tells him, quote, that transgender people have a high risk of sexual assault and violence, therefore it is for your safety that you be isolated. In 1880, and still in 2016, is Dr. Freud in the audience? In 1880 and 2016, the isolation of gender nonconforming people is framed as this act of benevolent protection from the public, as though internment of all sorts does not precipitate the very mental anguish the psych ward is meant to relieve. Fourth, and maybe this doesn't shock you at this point, 2016/16, New Brunswick. This is where I'm coming from. Thank you, Google Maps. When I myself was a psych patient in the very ugly Dr. Everett Chalmers Hospital, I was asked if I would prefer a male or female roommate. What agency, we might think. What patient-driven care. But what I heard was, pick your poison. After all, what does spatial choice mean in a psych ward, a milieu in which spatial confinement is the point? To riff on Audrey and Rich, this choice was compulsory, Leaving the psych ward wasn't an option, neither was not choosing. So what I'm suggesting is that the veneer of choice often conceals the brutal fact of captivity. The FGI, Facility Guidelines Institute, which is an American nonprofit from which 39 states have adopted healthcare design guidelines, so very influential group. The FGI echoes this. Of windows, FGI says, in the past, very heavy stainless steel screens were installed as a safety measure. Although still used in some facilities, these screens provide a very institutional or prison-like appearance. In other words, we can't have our institutions look institutional. We're not cruel. This superficial denial of the word's very purpose mirrors the logic of other recent internment innovations, say, pink police cells for kids. Yes, very humane. So, how can art and design change these things? How can it change the psych ward? I conclude with two responses. First, psych spaces need to be re-aestheticized and thus re-politicized. Between 1972 and 81, geographer Roger Ulrich studied 46 patients recovering from gallbladder surgery in a suburban Pennsylvania hospital. Half had a view of a brick wall, half had a landscape view. And the outcome was that folks who were looking at a natural setting healed more quickly and took fewer drugs. This study started this booming industry of evidence-based design, or EBD, which is really loved by medical professionals for its will to reduce design to a science. Maybe they would say elevate, I might say reduce. I suggest that a different approach would better unleash art's most potent powers of healing. We need to experiment with art in psych spaces. We could show patients the history of madness in art, or display, don't mind the typo here, display a vast array of art brut made by mad people. However, this FGI image represents how art is actually regarded by many psych professionals. Nothing says welcome to the jungle like a mural of apes in a psych ward. Very humanizing. Art's other use in wards is as occupational therapy, making rote crafts, busying hands as salve for idling minds. Given that, we could engage with art's history in institutions, as does trans artist Megan Morman. Their material is perler beads, a 1960s Swedish invention meant as occupational therapy in old age homes. Morman melts tens of thousands of beads together with an iron to create portraits of queer, often crazy artists, and stages what she calls art parties. Who's that guy in his underwear? Here, institutional therapy is turned towards a new kind of healing, one that doesn't include the pursuit of sanity, one that defines its party or its public as crazy, as queer, as trans. Another goal we could have would be to redesign the ward ourselves. Oh, a bit more art party. Yes, that's hanky coding surrounding everybody there. Since 2014, Hannah Hall and James Leadbitter have undertaken Mad Love, a designer asylum, the goal of which is to put the treat back in treatment. It's their joke, not mine. The duo visited 10 wards across the UK, also Riga, Zurich, Prague, did live illustrations of group interviews with psych patients, eventually launched a 3-month art/architecture psych installation. In the illustrations, art comes up often as something desired, white walls to attack with paint, and a source of destruction, Fabergé eggs to smash. We see color and ornament, lack of symmetry, plushness and contrast of textures, a real emphasis on sensuality. Here, for instance, a variety of smells. We see enclosures that undo a strict private-public binary. We get a rejection of straight lines, and we get a lot of whimsy, even playfulness with the history of psych spaces, a padded room, for example. Second imperative, with which I'll conclude. We must break the boundary between psych spaces and the public if we care about trans people being trans in public. Genderqueer artist Coral Short disrupts our idea of what is publicly appropriate. She choreographs these choir-like groups and then has them scream instead of sing, thereby making a place for loud, inscrutable, excessive emotion, a crazy scream of trans rage or queer pleasure. And here we see some responses. Very quizzical Montrealers. And as always, somebody calling the police. Their work, Crying Machine, forces participants to unleash emotion in public. Low tech to the max. Short chops onions for hours and cries with willing strangers. And we know that craziness is usually defined as sharing too much in public. But in practicing intimacy, she and Kimura Boal roam Montreal metro stations tied together as if to ask us what less visible constraints tie us up in public. In Plush, she's in there. I don't know if you can see. Short breaks from the stoicism of the sane public by bringing affection and stranger intimacy to the sidewalk. And there they are walking through a Hasidic neighborhood in Montreal. All to say, we need to force new publics into creation. The ability to do so isn't spread evenly. As Sarah Ahmed and so many other people say, racialized emotion is policed. White women tears seldom are. So when I insist that crazy emotion have a place or say that it's important, the demand is as much for white people to grow our emotional abilities, our empathy, and to be moved by emotion as anything else. One way for white or sane or cis people to translate these artworks into new publics is to, I think, redefine our idea of public danger. At Current, this is how we think of danger for the psychiatric patient. With what can we harm ourselves? Odd that we don't ask how we've already been harmed or will be by others, by publics. Chava Finkler shows that Toronto bylaws, for instance, enforce strict minimum distances between homes for psychiatric survivors, which makes communities of mutual support enclaves basically impossible. So let's say you're trans, you're crazy trans, you're trans crazy, you're outside, but are you really a member of the public? Others may stare, maybe you don't feel seen. You can see the latent craziness of the normative. But can others see it? Are you hallucinating? I say it is more than enough to make you go mad. Thank you.
So I'll take you a little bit to take you to a different context. I've come all the way from South Africa, and I invite you to join me in this journey in parts of the cities where I do some interventions. In April 2015, students at the University of Cape Town in South Africa captured part of the world's attention through the decolonial movement, Rhodes Must Fall. Born free, post-apartheid, this generation of youth rejected the idea that their birth signified an automatic entry into freedom. Following in their ancestors' paths, they chose to fight for their liberation. The irony that is democratic and post-apartheid South Africa is the resistant colonialism which this generation only nibbled at. Someone had dropped the ball in the euphoria of 1994. Post-apartheid may have a new look, but its realities reveal the traces and legacy of slavery and colonization that continue to shape the present in profound ways. At the University of Cape Town, this irony had been intolerable for many years, until the fall of the colonial master, Cecil John Rhodes. While Rhodes was only in concrete form as a statue, the statue's removal at the university revealed many other living statues, those claiming for him and it to be saved for history's sake. History matters when the powerful are removed. At the forefront of the decolonial movement, Rhodes must fall, Black women, queer, and trans students declared, if the movement is not intersectional, it is bullshit. A year later, the shit hit the fan, when the Black-led movement saw itself as deeply entrenched in cis-heteropatriarchy. The poster you see at the front of this picture, written, "Dear History, this revolution has women, gays, queers, and trans, remember that." The poster you see at the front of this picture had been an omen. What remains of this movement are memories of a removed statue, a space so loud in its emptiness. Those women, queer and trans students, are long forgotten. It is the absence of the statue that lingers. In 2000, the University of Cape Town added to its art collection a sculpture of Sari Batman. Now, Sari Batman was a Khoikhoi woman exhibited as a freak show attraction in Europe during the 19th century under the name Hottentot Venus. Sari Batman's body was used for scientific investigations. The sculpture was made by Cape Town-based artist Willie Bester, and it was located at the university's library. The sculpture became fiercely debated at the university by feminist groups since 2001. Only in 2018, a few months ago, until a few months ago, no action had been taken on the artwork, although it raised strong emotional responses among Black women in the university. During the decolonial movement, Rhodes Must Fall, in 2015 and 2016, feminist students and academic staff convened a series of engagements and interventions with this piece of artwork, robing the sculpture and engaging it in traditional cloth. They also engaged in traditional ceremonies, which the artist Willie Bester considered as vandalism. For the artist, the robing did not draw attention to histories of objectified Black women. Students, on the other hand, claimed robing the sculpture meant finally granting Sari Batman some respite from the colonial gaze. They hung essay notes on the cloth declaring, "It is not just a sculpture, it is not just a cloth, it is centuries of trauma." And the prerogative of looking but not being seen characterizes imperialist power. In the same year, the Trans Collective was formed during the Rhodes Must Fall movement out of the frustration with an overwhelmingly cis-privileged heteronormative decolonization movement. Students who were part of the Trans Collective, gender non-conforming, non-binary, and identified as trans-diverse. Using their voices and bodies, the Trans Collective offered a militant form of trans-feminist politics that was not shy to occupy space, undo erasure and invisibility at any cost, and challenge rigid and toxic gender constructs and hypermasculinity. On 9 March 2016, a year after Rhodes Must Fall campaign was started, the Center for African Studies at the university had planned to launch a photographic exhibition which would mark the 1-year anniversary of the movement. Launching the curated photographic and archived material exhibition of the Rhodes Must Fall movement were cisgender male professors who had been behind the scenes during the year-long protests at the university. On this day, however, they reincarnated themselves as the bearers of the decolonization narrative. They thus displaced the students who had been at the forefront of the movement and who had put their bodies on the line, often literally. 7 student activists from the Trans Collective stormed the gathering, mostly naked and painted with red body paint. They halted the exhibition opening, explained their protest on erasure, and lay down across the gallery. The symbolism was overwhelming. Only those brave enough to walk over trans bodies dared to enter the gallery space. Inside, contentions ensued, some not new to the curators. Dubbed as the trans capture, the intervention of the trans collective was twofold. It first highlighted the pervasive nature of tokenism, which also infiltrates within progressive movements such as the Rose Must Fall movement. For the trans collective, their presence, visibility, and labor in challenging gender binaries and norms could not be reduced to a few tokenistic photographs in an exhibition. They also challenged the curatorial approach of the exhibition, highlighting the exclusion of trans diverse voices. The exhibition's curators found themselves lacking in curating an engaging recent historical record that represents the central role of radical feminist politics that grounded the Rose Must Fall movement. Having to close the exhibition before anyone saw it, curators were left with the question, was it necessary to confine a decolonial movement in a gallery when the real work of decolonization had not yet been done? What would be commemorated by the exhibition within white walls of a gallery? Whose story gets priority, and from whose archive? These questions linger and are relevant not only for the university, but for queer movements in the city. Cape Town has a both beautiful and ugly history. Cape Town is where the university is located. Its presence is further complicated by what seems to be progressive politics on gender diversity and sexuality while hiding racism. For many, this culminates in the annual Pride Parade, which has revealed narrow politics of celebrating whiteness. In 2016, as you can see on the left poster, Cape Town Pride insulted city dwellers with a theme for the event, Gay, Proud, Colorblind, which was seen as entrenching separation along race, gender, class, and sexual orientation in a city that is known to be racist. Again, students, artists, and activists responded, as was the public, although the theme was then changed to the second poster, Brave Enough. And you can see already there was an intervention there. Dean Hutton, a trans student and artist, offered an appropriate response at that year's Pride March. Fuck white people, fuck white pride. An intervention that was censored by Facebook and eventually led the artist to the Equality Court for promoting hate speech. The judge residing over the case admitted that the work was neither racist nor hate speech. Rather, white is used within the context of protest art and debate to refer to structures, systems, knowledge, skills, and attitudes which keep white people racist, which are to be rejected, confronted, and dismantled. In response to the new theme, queer and trans activists, students, and artists, mainly from the university, provoked the theme Brave Enough, questioning the white, gay, male, cisgender organizers. Are you brave enough to exclude us? Marching alongside the ones who were brave enough, they exposed the visible racial divisions that were masked by liberal politics of pride. The interventions I have shown all perhaps deal with layered erasures through history and the present. They are all part of the work I initiated in 2014 under the banner Queer in Africa, a series of public interventions that engage the city's publics on the possibilities of imagining new presents and histories that prioritize queer and trans lives. While located at the university, Queer in Africa occupies the city's landscapes, uncovering hidden stories that have contributed to an idea of Cape Town as Africa's gay capital. In the latest intervention, working with scholars, artists, and activists, we returned to sites that city officials discarded because of the presence of queer life. And in these sites, we rewrote histories, placed our bodies, and contemplated on new possibilities. The one you see is Graf's Pool, where two scholars wrote a play revisiting the city's erased queer history. We were reminded at this site by graffiti with the famous quote, "What lies behind us and what lies before us are tiny matters compared to what lies within us." Queer and trans lives have and continue to face multiple forms of erasure. In the country where I live, South Africa, and in the continent at large, this is more so. As I speak to you now, a queer feminist activist is imprisoned in Uganda for writing against dictatorship on Facebook. A witch hunt on all LGBT people in Tanzania is underway. In South Africa, not a day passes without a brutal murder of a young girl, a woman, a lesbian, or a trans woman. Young lesbian and trans women die at the hands of neighbors, family members, and community folks. Thus, while we are excited about sexual liberties and gender recognition or dismantling boundaries, binaries, we are also wary of the circumstances under which we live. Our struggle is to be seen and heard as fully human. Through these interventions, we're slowly rewiring society's views on what it means to live with each other in our differences. It is a challenging task, but we will get there together. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Henrietta, and everyone else involved, Jackson, for your very diligent organizing and professionalism. I'm really pleased to be here today. What I want to do is speak about my experience working as an artist, and specifically working in museums as institutions that construct and produce different knowledges. Many years ago, I started finding images in catalogs and scattered in certain archaeological museums throughout Latin America of objects that represented homoerotic encounters from pre-Hispanic Latin American cultures. And I became very intrigued to understand what these objects meant, and not so much to recognize that there were homoerotic practices in indigenous cultures, even though that was something interesting to know, but more to understand why there was very little knowledge about them, and there was a real certain kind of erasure and documentation from the social sciences and the humanities around some of these objects. So the three that you find here are some examples of Quimbaya culture in Colombia and Mochica culture in Peru. A lot of these objects were not only destroyed, but they have systematically remained out of view from museum collections throughout the world. I went on and did some research and found just really a handful of scholars that have been thinking about the meaning of these objects. And thought it would be an interesting exercise to produce a project that would think about the process of constructing a history from a homoerotic perspective. But very much thinking about, again, not so much at pointing to the fact that these behaviors or identities existed in the past, but more about the process of colonization that took place at the moment of the conquest of the Americas. And that is a colonization of bodies, an erasure of certain traditions, but also very much an imposition of certain understandings around sexuality and gender. So the project that you see here is a project that is titled Towards a Homoerotic Historiography, and it's basically a small, hyperformal museum within a museum. The image that you see here is at the Museum of Modern Art in Medellin last year, and basically the project is composed of 20 small lightbox vitrines that are embedded onto the wall and backlit, that present replicas of 20 of these objects that I collected from several sources in the past years. The idea was twofold: to create a hyper-formal space of presentation, the kind that you would find at a museum such as the Metropolitan Museum or the Louvre or the AGO. But also to think about the miniaturization of these objects. The replicas I produced are basically like smaller than a thumbprint. And to think about that process of erasure and visibility of these practices. I was interested in thinking about how to represent these objects, specifically from the perspective of a homoerotic lens, very much aware of the problematics of doing so. of understanding that the kind of framework that I was using to design this installation and this idea could also be another form of colonial imposition. But the idea was precisely to point at that, how bodies and minds were colonized, how knowledges were produced through legitimized systems of violent oppression. So these are some of the examples of the objects. And this is an image of the installation at the Perez Art Museum in Miami. It was important to me to be working within these institutions, these kind of visible mainstream institutions, which, again, in response to the kind of presentations that have also determined the ways in which we find something to be legitimately constructed or not. So the color of the wall, the protrusions in the walls, etc., are a part of creating a line of reasoning around formal issues also as a way of thinking about the colonization of categories around gender and sexuality. Last year, I had a chance to work collaboratively with an organization called Secret Garden in Amsterdam, which is based in Amsterdam. And it's an organization that looks to the refugee crisis in Europe, and in specifically within the Dutch context. Secret Garden is founded and run by volunteers, and they're all LGBTQI people of Middle Eastern descent. Upon an invitation to create a commission for the museum, I thought that it would be very interesting to work within this context, primarily because there is something within the Dutch context specifically that interests me, which is this idea of the Dutch having constructed an idea of hyper-liberalism, a feminist nation, a sexual diversity, fully accepting country, etc. However, in the public and media displays, policy conversations and conversations around some right-wing groups within the Dutch context, these limits seem to have been challenged upon the encounter with a racial, ethnic, and religious other. So I approached Secret Garden and asked them if they thought it would be a good idea to counteract those kind of media mainstream discourses around racialized, ethnic, and religious others by producing a project and presenting it within the Stedelijk Museum. Some of you who may have been there, it is one of the most prominent contemporary and modern art museums in Europe. It has thousands of visitors a day, and it's loud. It speaks loudly. People pay attention. So the idea was to produce a work together with Secret Garden that would speak about the drama of the refugee crisis in a kind of testimony form, working with 11 people who either have been seeking asylum, have received asylum, or are in the process of doing so. And at the same time, use the institution as a kind of loudspeaker to speak about those very porous challenges that haven't really been reported and talked about in the Dutch media around what it means to suddenly use feminism or sexual diversity openness to counteract another one that is in struggle, that is struggling.
دابا كنسكن في فايزبرغ باقي في كامب و كنعاني بصح في الاول كنت كنلبس فساتين ديالي اكسيتيرا ولكن دابا حيت عييت ما نبقى نتشكى صافي جو فو وليت كنلبس حتى انا السراوال و جاكيطات وصافي غير باش ما بحال كتعيا خايب راسك ما كيبقاش يتحمل هاد صافي تبقى حياتك كامله مضارب معاهم وتناد الفتره هادي بحال كتستسلم وكنتاسف حيت بديت كنفكر في الاستسلام حيت صافي ما يمكنش كل نهار كنحاولوا نبقاو معزولين نسدوا علينا في بلاصتنا. كان انا واحد صديق ديالي كنسدوا علينا في بلاصتنا كنضحكوا مع بعضنا ونخرجوا بعيد على الكامب باش نقدروا نحسوا زعما غير شويه ديال الامان. واخا كنمشيو عند المسؤولين في الكامب هكا كيقول لك احنا غندويو معاهم. انا بالنسبه لي المشكله ماشي في انك تدوي معاهم، المشكله انه كاين واحد الاقليه مضطهده اللي هما الجاي بيبل اللي هما الكوير بيبل، وهما وسط واحد مضطهدين اخرين. كاين بوليس باش يحميو ضد الموفوبيك اكسترا ولكن ما عمرني زعما تحت في ابل. واحد المره واحد قال لي شي حاجه بحال زعما انت ما خصكش تبقى دار. فاش كنمشي عند القوه فاش كنمشي عند القوه كنقول لهم الشرفه شنو جرى ليا وهذا واش ممكن نتصل بالبوليس. ماشي جوج المرات في زندم فاش كنت في كامب ديال زندم فاش كنت في تير ابل كنقول القوه واش ممكن نتصل بالبوليس، ولكن كيقولوا لي لا صافي ما يمكنش يدير لك شي حاجه ما يمكنش. وبحال كعجزت صافي علاش غنمشي للبوليس مادام ما كانش واحد مادام ما قتلونيش مثلا نتسنى شويه.
So Mala and the other people are pointing to these tensions around the Dutch identity and the identity of a Middle Eastern refugee. Another aspect of the project that I thought would be interesting to work on was the inclusion of historical objects from other museum collections that spoke about the histories of migration and refugees in the Netherlands. Considering the Netherlands as a huge colonial empire that that controlled so many nations around the world. So we worked closely with a researcher and historian at the Rijksmuseum, the Amsterdam Museum, and the Colonial Museum. There is a museum that still has that name. Actually, the Tropen Museum, which means tropical museum. And we selected about 40 objects that would tell the history of the Netherlands in relationship to histories of migration. Like the previous project that I showed before, the museography in this project was also very important to me. I wanted to kind of replicate the kind of legitimizing museological design aesthetics of a space like the Rijksmuseum or the Metropolitan Museum, etc., to present a counter-narrative and a kind of queering of the ways in which those aesthetics have influenced the construction of meaning. And so basically what you're seeing here is the vitrines and then the objects. But we used a highly reflective glass so that the videos that were hanging in the screens across from them would be reflected onto the vitrines themselves, and they create that kind of infinity effect onto the vitrine. And these are the members of Secret Garden, the day of the opening and talks. Lastly, I wanted to briefly present another strategy within a cultural institution. For some years, starting in 2012 and ending in 2014, I created this video archive of video portraits. Again, working very closely in collaboration with about 15 trans and intersex and gender nonconforming grassroots organizations in 4 different countries. And it would take too long to explain the whole context of those groups, but I'm going to focus on one situation that was produced in collaboration with Red Multicultural de Mujeres Trans de Guatemala, the multicultural network of trans women of Guatemala, which is an organization led by Galilea Bracho, a trans sex worker working in Guatemala City. So we created with them 15 video portraits of the members of the organization. The idea was for the video portraits to represent a way for them to present their work. They have very little money. Basically, there is no fundraising. The project was initiated via an invitation to participate in Bienal de Arte País, which is a fairly important regional biennial in the Central American context. And the invitation was like, why don't you show your video in our museum? And it was very clear both to me and Galilea that showing the video in the museum would just replicate an endless cycle of misguided representation of these struggles. So we decided, in the very conservative context of the Guatemalan cultural scene, to actually occupy the space of the Spanish Cultural Center, which was the venue that had been allocated to us, and create an event that would actually give center stage and all the visibility to the members of Red Mutrans. And they had a very specific idea in mind, which was fundraising. So what we did is Galilea and the members of Red Mutrans organized this event using the media platform and networks of the biennial itself, the funding that was allocated to me as an individual artist coming from the United States to produce a work, and use all of that to create a kind of media machine that reported on the struggles and the political work of Red Mutrans as a grassroots organization with no funding. So it was really interesting because it was an organization that had traditionally been erased, not reported on by any media platforms in Guatemala, to suddenly being reported on the front cover of the cultural section. So there was a kind of inversion of using my personal visibility as an artist and kind of subverting the structure of that place within the cultural circuit through for an idea of fundraising. These are the members of Red Mutrans the day of the event. It was also quite interesting in the sense that the Spanish Cultural Center didn't have explicitly a discriminatory policy against trans or anybody's really, but many of the women that attended the event said that they never felt welcome in such a space, so they never even dared to enter. And at some point, there were 200 trans bodies in the space. 100 of them were indigenous women from the regions of Guatemala. So it was a really kind of interesting contrast. And the director of the Spanish Cultural Center at some point came to me sweating and said, like, you understand what is happening? And I said, like, what is happening? And he said, the directors of Telefónica, our biggest funders, are here. And I said, so? That's where it ended. Not the event, but the conversation. Anyway, so I think I just wanted to present those three projects to think about the ways of kind of circumnavigating, perhaps piercing through institutional places, and ultimately also to think about the kind of contradictory position of an artist working with institutions, right? In the sense that we want to produce social change, but we're tied to concerns of corporate sponsorship and financing. So I've just been trying to think about ways in which you can draw circles around this and still produce projects that maybe can have more meaning. Thank you.
What I'd like to do, I know we started a little bit late, so I'm assuming we can go slightly over the schedule. What I'd like to do is maybe just ask a couple of short questions to one or more of the panelists, and then we will open up for questions from the audience and a broader conversation. And I think the first thing that strikes me is that when we think about trans, and we think about trans in the context of this particular event, we think about crossing genders, crossing gender boundaries. But in the presentations that you all showed, you showed such a much more expanded and intertwined notion of crossing, and like crossing institutional boundaries, like literally, Lucas, like the institution, the boundary of the institution, the well-known institution itself, and of institutionalization, but also then in Zethu and Carlos's work, positioning trans as something that is across social, spatial, geographic boundaries in a world historical sense, right? Like you don't get these kinds of situations without considering, hundreds of years of colonization and what that has, the kinds of places that has brought to bear on us. And so I'm wondering, I don't have a firm question about that, but it kind of blew my mind about how much crossing we were doing this morning. And I wonder if any of you, perhaps one of you might comment on how you come to situate your work in such an expanded way when you think about something like gender. I guess this is like an invitation to expound a little bit more
Sure.
On any part of the work that you've shown.
Crawford.
Do you want to go?
I'm an English prof, into the literature. Man, some English departments are just not even like reaching for post-colonial or decolonial, like just loving on British lit. So it's an interesting context from which to think about crossing. But I mentioned English and discipline just because I was going to say I'm interested in the metaphor of crossing and intersections. And I wonder if we all were after something slightly, like crossing suggests to me there's a thing called trans, there's a thing called mentally ill. If you're there, then you are both of those things. But I wonder if there's a metaphor that's a bit more blurry, maybe.
It's an interesting question. Thank you, Kian. In response, I will refer to one of my students who just who just published a PhD called Bodies Over Borders, and it tells the journeys that trans asylum seekers make, the journeys that they take from other parts of the African continent into South Africa, because there's an idea that South Africa is because of its progressive laws and constitution, it allows for all forms of gender diversity to exist. And many people arrive, when they come to South Africa, they choose Cape Town, because Cape Town is regarded as this beautiful city that is so, not only liberal, but it kind of allows for all forms of being to exist. But of course, as I shared with you, this is a kind of a myth. And in this book, B. Kamenga tells stories of trans asylum seekers who, when they arrive in their what they consider the promised city of Cape Town, they first have to cross in multiple ways. They have crossed the border, very difficult, in very dangerous ways, but they also cross many other ways. They cross in the sense that they have to deny themselves of who they are, because when they arrive in South Africa, when they are seen by people from their countries, if, for example, you arrive and you're from Ethiopia and other Ethiopians see you and they see that you are gender non-conforming, you always have to hide behind, behind normativity, so that you don't have to interface with violence. So even in that, there's a crossing. But also, the state requires you to cross in another way, because when you arrive in South Africa and you have to go to the Home Affairs Department where your asylum papers are given to you, the system is designed in a way that it forces you to choose a queue, and you're either in the male queue or the female queue. And trans people have to engage with this at all times. And so even when when they talk about the experience of being in South Africa, it's always a constant kind of crossing. I have to cross the queue. Some days, on Wednesdays, if I'm standing with the Ethiopians, I have to pretend that I'm one thing. And on Fridays, if I'm standing with, with women, I have to pretend to be another thing. But at the same time, as I'm moving around the city, I have to engage with the police in a way that the police will see my body, but see an identity document that does not correspond to who I am. So crossing is always in many different ways, from one country to the next, within oneself and within a city, etc.
Yeah.
So.
That's super interesting, and I'll pivot a little bit for Carlos. This idea that Zethu was saying is South Africa and Cape Town as creating a myth of being particularly welcoming, socially welcoming, a sort of liberal place certainly is at work in the Netherlands, right? That does go out of its way, and in many ways, I think it's for real. There are some ways in which the Netherlands has created a fairly open and welcoming environment. A lot of my work actually is in the Netherlands, and it's about things like water infrastructure in the Netherlands. I found fairly easy to get into conversations about many social issues, less so when it comes to race, like race and the history of colonization that the country and those institutions have taken part in. I wonder if you could expand a bit on your conversations in that context, bringing race and the history of colonization so directly into one of the most central art spaces in the Netherlands.
I mean, I think one of the really interesting things that have emerged in political conversations around the LGBT movements in the last decade or so is this idea of gay rights becoming a shield against other forms of perceived danger in Europe and elsewhere. I'm speaking specifically in the Dutch context, for example, of the idea that the evil Middle Eastern colored other is going to come to threaten the liberty of the beautiful gays and lesbians and feminists that we have constructed so hard in this country. And of course, this is not something that is lived on a day-to-day basis on the street. I think actually Dutch people are really open-minded and cool, but certainly within the political discourse, right? And certainly within the formation of political parties that are thriving on creating that kind of rhetoric of fear and against, for their own protection, if you will, from that perspective. I mean, this is something that happens in so many other places. I mean, without wanting to open this topic, which is so controversial, Israel is the prime example of that, right? So Israel is this kind of isolated, insular space within, again, the kind of evil Middle East where gays and lesbians can thrive. Tel Aviv Pride is the most amazing celebration of diversity and inclusion in this island. So, and it's marketed like that. So I think that's one of the things that I wanted to talk about was like, what are the limits of those policies? What is the limit of social inclusion and acceptance when you are faced with these really challenging ideas about racial mixing in a country like Holland, which is very white or perceives itself as very white. So I think that was at the heart of the project. But I also wanted to say something without wanting to speak too long, which is speaking of contradictions and crossings. One of the things that has motivated a lot of this work is recognizing that also the language of criticality that I have been given through my studies, through art studies, philosophy studies, and others, the recognition that that language was also a form of colonial imposition. So thinking about queer theory as being anchored in a kind of Western, European, and American model of thinking did not apply to thinking about queer bodies in the global South, right? How the LGBT movement and these policies are also very much designed to privilege certain kinds of bodies in the North, and how do they get applied in the South? So I think that has been one of the really challenging aspects for me to think through the work is like, how do you challenge the construction of knowledge from the perspective of language, from the perspective of aesthetics, from the perspective of navigating through your body an institution. How do you use those same strategies, which is something I've been trying to do? Do you go against them in the form of an intervention, which I suspect is something that you are interested in?
Yeah, and I think it's real that this privilege of knowledge, of like critical theory and queer theory, certainly it's rife in academia, right? Like those of us who are often in academic spaces, we feel that really strongly. So it's something that is a privilege of often folks in the global north, Euro-American institutions, and in academia. And I'm also thinking that this idea of privilege might have to be thought about also in art making. So I'm, Carlos, you actually mentioned this when you said that you were trying to bring your privilege as a well-known artist who can access various spaces to help those folks, marginalized folks like trans women. I can't remember how you said it, but to access or be present in spaces that they previously had felt not comfortable accessing. And I think, so that shows one way that art and privilege can be a part of creating more access. But I also think about the ways that, for me, coming from Los Angeles right now and in many other cities, art has taken on a much more dubious honor of being a force that ushers in urban development, economic development, and oftentimes gentrification and displacement. And I wonder for each of you or any of you, to what extent you have, actually I think maybe for Zethu, because when you talked about bringing visibility to the queer spaces, perhaps the discarded queer spaces of Cape Town, are you concerned about bringing as well a different lens or a different eye or more attention to places by people who might follow artists, like developers and hipster yuppies?
Yes and no. Yes. Let me first start with the no. Some of the places that we've occupied through this project were places where gentrification has already taken place. And it's places where bodies such as ours are not wanted. And so occupying those spaces is a kind of disruption. And it's uncomfortable for us, but it's also uncomfortable for the people who live in those spaces because, we bring dirt as queer and trans people. And I'm comfortable with that, with bringing that discomfort and that notion of dirt, because we're already in a city that is filthy in many ways. Yes, in the sense that right now, I'm not sure what's happening, well, maybe also in the US and other parts of the world, queerness has kind of like become sexy, fashionable, and so whatever you do and where there are lots of queer people, there's always like, a whole kind of like mass movement of people wanting to follow because they want to be current. They want to feel that they're with the times. So that part concerns me when we do this kind of work, because we invite people to places where, as you say, developers or all forms of capitalists would want to make more money. But it also forces us to be kind of careful about what kind of intervention do we do? And how do we time it so that it, so that developers don't feel that it's they have an opportunity to exploit. And so it's a consciousness about, always being far ahead, but also being critical at the same time. Yeah.
And then my last question to Lucas. So you talked about bringing design to the asylum in some ways. In architecture, we haven't had enough, but we've started to have some conversations about the responsibility of doing things like trying to design the prison, so to bring a more social or more acceptable way to those kinds of institutions. And for many architects, I think we've come pretty strongly on the side that there is no way, particularly in the US in our criminal justice system, there is no way to actually design a better prison. And I wonder how you think about that particular quandary when it comes to designing the mental ward.
Great question, thank you. I don't think there's a great way to design a psych ward. I think I'm kind of on board with what you're describing, in that I don't want to think about a cooler psych ward, a more whimsical psych ward. It's imprisonment, it's internment based on ideas of what we consider appropriate behavior in public, often along lines of gender and race and ability and everything else. So I think there's two ways we can go, and one is to beautify spaces of internment. Let's have a queer border wall. Not possible, not happening. And I think the other way of going is to try to use art in the public sphere politically. So that's why I was kind of drawn to this art installation of a utopic psych ward. I don't think, okay, if we build a psych ward that looks like that, it'll be awesome to have to eat institutional grade meat and not talk to your family. I'm more interested in how making utopic fantasies of how these spaces could work leave us with different ideas about how the public can work. So I guess I'm just agreeing in a way that I don't think there could be some awesomely designed psych ward with walls that make you feel really great. That said, I do wish there was some more art in there, other than 1,000-piece puzzles with always 4 pieces missing and basic cable. It would be cool if we did see art as part of quality of life. That would be a concrete change I would be into.
Thank you. So any thoughts, questions from the audience? And I think there are 2 mics on both sides. And if you could actually direct the question to a particular speaker, that would be awesome. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. This was fascinating. I was struck by the parallel between asylum and asylums.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry I can't specify this, because I feel that every one of these fantastic speakers could address this paradox. And, having myself been a consumer of hospitals and, had children interred temporarily, there's this tension between the spaces of segregation, which are often felt as safe spaces, and the spaces of, feeling okay that you are being offensive to somebody by being in their space. You know what I mean? These are the tensions, I think, that organize this fantastic discussion around publicness and public space, because the parallel shadow is always privateness and private space, and a kind of segregation where you can be safe. So part of me was wondering about the tension of having a separate parade, or the tension of having a separate homoerotic historiography, or because on the one hand we need these segregations to produce a kind of forceful, alternative of the radical edge of otherness. On the other hand, so much of the desire here is for the space itself to change, to include. So I just wondered if you could reflect on this complexity of asylum as in something that is deeply desired and, lives are being lost over that passage to asylum. And then, the corresponding, juridical internment of that.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I was thinking about that too, that we both talked about asylum, and in very different ways, but maybe the similarity or the overarching thing is that asylum is this, I'm just kind of repeating some of what you said, but that asylum is this supposed promised, if it's land or space or whatever it is, but like a promised destination of safety. And I kind of want to just take a second to add Canada to the list of places where everyone's like, you can smoke pot, you can get married if you're gay, where I know like a lot of queer folks of color and a lot of my grad students in my department are from the Middle East, say, oh God, yeah, really not what I expected. The racism here is not Canadian politeness. It is blatant. So I just kind of wanted to add that in there on this topic of like asylum not being exactly what we want. I think the comparison would be that an asylum or a psych ward is thought of as this place that is going to be safe. And that's the question you get asked, like, are you going to hurt yourself? Or this is the safe place, a safe space, maybe one of the safe spaces that is actually really unsafe. Whether it's because of who you're roomed with or how you are treated, or people see your mental breakdown due to multiple oppressions as having to do with the fact that you're a little overweight. It's not going to be this place that is this safe, affirming experience. So that's where I would go with that comment, that there is a similarity there.
I mean, there's the second piece of your, sorry, I lost you, I don't know where you are. Oh, sorry. The second piece of your question that I think it's interesting, perhaps as a provocation to consider, is the question of separatism and creating these spaces that are tired of being included and tolerated and perhaps just demanding a different kind of autonomy, political autonomy. And I think it's a really complicated thing to think about. There is a lot of privilege in thinking about a separatist space. Who can afford to claim separatism? Who has who has the possibility of claiming that space? I think oftentimes we romanticize the kind of ethos of the sexual liberation movement of the 60s as burning the institution, demanding radical change. But who can do that now? Is it the kind of white passing artist like me who can afford the privileges of being invited to an institution such as this one to say these things? But what happens with people who are confined, are not accepted, are seeking asylum, are in transition, are crossing? And I think that that's a really interesting thing to think about, particularly right now around the questions of visibility, for example. Has visibility really been a successful strategy? When, like in Tanzania, you have these squads seeking out those people who thought visibility would give them a place in society. So I think it's a really tenuous and complicated space around privilege, around access, around contradiction, around just a ton of hatred. And I think that, I don't know, I just leave that there, but maybe there's something to discuss around some of those topics.
I saw another question over there. You have a question. I'm not sure if this is being recorded, but if it is, you might want to go to the mic, but if not, shout it out. Oh, awesome.
Hi. Thank you all so much. I just learned so much from each of you. My question's a kind of a bratty question for Carlos. Sorry. And it perhaps speaks to one of the sort of underlying tensions between the LG and the T. And it's just about that first project you showed. How do you know that the bodies being depicted in the artifacts are like male bodies?
Yeah. I mean, there is some documentation around some of these objects. There is studies around them. They appear in some of the indigenous codices, like the Aztecs and the Mayans. And they are, the conversation around this is based on anatomy. There are male, anatomically perceived male figures in the depictions. And that's how they have been discussed within the kind of literature of the social sciences. Nobody's claiming necessarily that they are one thing or the other one, but there's also a conversation around the invisibility of anatomically female bodies from those representations as well. So some people are writing about how were these cultures relating to this kind of potential same-sex encounters amongst figures that are not represented in these subjects. What survived colonization? So many of these subjects were destroyed. I encountered countless stories of archaeologists who not only during the time of the conquest itself, but much later on in excavations going with hammers, destroying all the parts that would be offensive to a public. So I think there's not any, assumption is the only way that has been used to study them. And I agree with you if the subtext of your question is that is incredibly problematic. But at the same time, that is what we have to work with. So there is either critical eye storage or speculation around them.
I just really have to say out loud, like, terms like anatomically male or anatomically
Yeah,
female, they're used all the time.
I know, it's a...
Listen to them all the time. It feels like this conference, like, it can't be the place where
I agree with you. I'm just relaying the kind of information I've found in this, the documentation around them. It is also not my place to like assign some kind of meaning to these subjects because I don't have the information around them. I'm kind of working with, kind of contesting what's there. And thank you.
If there's one more question, we'll finish with that. Yes.
Thank you very much for everything you said today. And thinking about crossing the borders, and as a border crosser in gender and space, I see it as a survival tactic. And I talk to my friends and everybody in my life as a survival tactic. Now, thinking about thriving and liberation as something that may not be, is not anchoring colonialism. Can we dream it? Can we even think about it when we're living in a colonized world?
Yeah.
Yeah, I cannot even think about it. So I was like, maybe you will. Maybe you have an idea.
I mean, I don't have a great answer, but I'll say something. Since I talked about mental illness, which for a lot of people manifests as what we might medically call depression, but let's say feeling really crappy, either looking at the political world or histories of colonialism and racism. Like, there's a lot of reasons to feel really crappy. Berlantin, Cvetkovic, not that you need to know those cats, are always pointing out depression is political, like it's not just chemical. There are reasons we feel the way that we feel and get in emotional ruts. So I feel like I was maybe speaking to that in some way or another. Like, how do we feel good when there's so many reasons to feel bad? And I think maybe I'm just saying across experiences, I hear what you're saying, and it is not easy to dream into hope and think positively, which is what all the nurses want to teach you to do in a rote way with handouts. it's not easy, but it's what makes you keep living. So yeah, it's not easy.
And I think some of this comes back to the first question, the part about segregated spaces as well. And I think, we confront that a lot, like to what extent we want to enforce or to be able to have different kinds of spaces for folks who identify in various ways. And I think at heart is what I think we're talking about here, which is that when we have power disparities, we need to acknowledge those, right? And that those imbalances of power, which happen in the best of situations. So even it's certainly in a room like this, in the institutional context that we're in the LIST Center, and this goes to your question, at the LIST Center at MIT, which is an incredibly complex and oftentimes problematic and oftentimes amazing space. I think what we can do is to keep flagging when we are being inadequate in the face of these kinds of resilient power structures, right? So I do thank you for bringing up the inadequacy of the way that we talk about things. I feel that often, like being embedded in the social sciences and then reaching out to folks in critical theory and coming back to planning and being like, or architecture, my God. But I want to thank the speakers for bringing your thoughts and your work. And I want to thank you all for coming on a Saturday morning, and also to the organizers for bringing what has amounted to a series of trans-geographical, transgender, trans-institutional perspective to start us off today. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.